It is July 1st. So welcome everybody to the latest episode of Sympraxis. We'll jump right in. We've got a half hour. There's a lot of content to cover. Relatively small group today, so we're excited to field some of your very specific and directed questions. We put some slides together, but as you probably have gathered, if you've listened to us or talked to us at all, we're willing to diverge into any and all topics that are of interest to you, and some that are just of interest to us. So this is the team of folks on the line. All six of us. We all have a slightly different role and a slightly different approach to whatever solution that we're talking about. And the solution that we're talking about today is another drill down on modernization, right? People going from classic to modern. And there's a lot of places where I used to use a certain web part. I used to use a certain solution component. I used to use a certain approach to get things done in SharePoint. And in modern, that solution or web part or component is different or doesn't exist anymore. So we're going to talk about a little bit of mapping on a web part by web part basis. I used to do X in classic. I intend to do Y in modern. So this is where we're drilling down. This kind of goes to that group shot of the roles and the different approaches that we have. Today, we're really going to focus primarily on the IA and governance piece and the when to use what piece. And it's not so much application specific when to use what as it is within SharePoint specifically. Let's talk about how we accomplish in modern some things that we're used to doing in maybe a different way in classic. So Emily, we never ended up with Harvey balls, but this is kind of the money shot and a little bit of the capability mapping from things I used to do in classic and the old way of doing them to the new way. So maybe we can jump in here. And Emily, if you want to talk about some of the just getting started with classic web parts and how we map them to modern.
So I'd say one of the first things to think about when you're going to classic and modern is to evaluate your content as well. Content is always going to be the center of whatever you're doing. So don't skip this piece because it's not just a user interface update. So once you know what kind of content you have to present, then you're diving into this web part capability mapping to see what you can use in the new space. And there's a couple big primary differences of what you had in classic versus modern. And the biggest ones that I see come up are the content editor and the script editor web parts. So you don't have either of those anymore. So for the content editor web part, you're using now the text editor web part where you can put in all of your text, but you can't add any script. You also don't have that hex code capability to change the colors in your text in the text web part. That should be added to your site theme instead. And then I'll just pause there in case any of our Sympraxis teammates want to talk a little bit about the branding in modern.
Yeah, I think that the big sort of gotcha or this is really different is that no script thing with the content editor. You know, we used to be able to jam just about anything into the content editor web part, including JavaScript, CSS,
yeah,
HTML, and that's just that whole model of injecting functionality into a page is gone in modern, and the page, the underlying page architecture is just drastically different. No master pages, no classic web parts. All of that stuff has changed. So if you're used to trying to do things pixel perfect with your text or with your graphics, whatever, it's not really a possibility anymore. And to me, that's a good thing, even though, and we've talked about this on other calls, we made a fortune in some ways doing pixel perfect work, but it wasn't focusing on the content. It was focusing on how the content looked. And so really taking a step back from that and focusing on the content itself, I think is a really good thing.
Mark, are there two exceptions to that no scripting? One, I think we've identified in here, the highlighted content web part, the ability to drop KQL directly into that web part.
Yeah, that's not scripting though. That's not, that's not adding JavaScript to this.
It's not JavaScript. It's code-ish is kind of
right.
where I was going, right?
So So there is no sort of there's no surface area for the citizen developer who used to write JavaScript to jam into the page. You have to use the SharePoint framework or the SharePoint framework. And the only way you can deploy SharePoint framework solutions is by going through deployment through the app catalog. So it becomes a gated thing as opposed to the way it used to be where we could just add arbitrary functionality to pages.
And Mark, is the second exception to that, no scripting, the JSON that you can drop into list and library formatting, or has that been changed? That's all through the UI now. There's not just a window to drop in a chunk of JSON.
This is where that, what is code versus what is content really becomes much more fuzzy. That JSON is actually JavaScript object notation actually represents data. So we're using a data structure in order to drop functionality into column formatting or view formatting. So that's not scripting either. I mean, when we say script, we're really talking about JavaScript in this case.
Got it.
And I kind of want to jump in, and Mark Chrisman said it in the chat room too. Though he said it from the other side. One of the things that I loved about the content editor web part back in the day was, as a non-dev, it was easy for me to find solutions to problems out on the internet that was a big blob of JavaScript that hid this or hid that or made snowflakes fall down on my pages and things like that. And I used the heck out of content editor web parts, and missing that, being able to just grab stuff off the web and drop it into a page, I miss that a little bit. And I understand that, so Mark's looking at it from he had to go clean it up. I was definitely using it from the trying to add functionality for my users bit.
Yeah, I would say.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, I would say that is if you don't understand what and this is a topic for another conversation, but no one should be copying and pasting stuff that they don't know what it does.
Well, there's a difference between being able to read through it and understanding what it does and being able to write it myself from a blank sheet of, whatever.
Yeah. Yeah. So, and maybe you're different than other people who were doing that, because I think that's part of the problem, is just copying and pasting stuff that ends up, bringing down the page performance.
Yeah. Well, and to that one, you could also just go to the web part maintenance page, and if somebody dropped a content editor web part in that broke the page, you could go to the web part maintenance page and pull it out. And
there were certainly cases where we stretched that capability beyond where it should have ever happened.
That I guilty as charged. Guilty as charged.
And I was a part of the problem here as well as part of the
solution. You are always part of the problem, Mark.
There are different viewpoints on this, right? If you were providing functionality that had actual value and it served its purpose, it was awesome. If you went and copied and pasted stuff from somebody's blog, including mine, and you didn't know what you were doing and you just dropped this stuff into pages, you could cause a lot of problems. So it was all about, the governance thing applies, the expertise thing applies, the understanding what you're stealing from someone's blog thing applies. So the fact that stuff all sort of becomes gated with the SharePoint framework now, I'm not necessarily a huge fan of that, but I think that it's a step in the right direction for a lot of organizations.
Yeah. Not to derail us too much, but
sorry.
I mean, technically speaking, there is still a, Mikael Svensson wrote the PNP web part that is the replacement for it, the modern replacement for it. So you can technically still do it if your org is one that is small enough or has no governance, and you want to go down that road, you can go down that road. But I think you're opening yourself up to potentially having a really broken experience. And I think the other piece of this that's different with SharePoint Online, so yes, I understand that classic SharePoint Online gave you this ability, but the difference with SharePoint Online and the difference with on-prem was that you had complete control of your farm. Your farm was installed at that time. It had that set of, specifications. You knew how the pages were laid out. And if you wanted to do DOM manipulation or whatever it might be, you had control over that farm. If you're talking about SharePoint Online, that UX is changing constantly. And things that you might be manipulating or changing, one day, the next day may not work, and you wouldn't necessarily know that that's happening. Now, if you have a low threshold to that, the pain of that situation, then it's no big deal. But if you're in a big organization, that can be, that could be a problem. So
yeah. So I mean, this list that we've got here, we were at least attempting to focus on out of the box web parts, but that the sort of third party thing, like the Mikhail Svensson's content editor web part built in SPFX, there is an increasingly large set of third party web parts like the Modern Search web parts, which are incredibly awesome, that you still have to install in your environment. So there's still a gate there. So if you're going to go down that road, you have to make a decision as an organization.
So can we talk, and Emily, could you take us back to a couple other places where we would have used the script editor web part, where there's new componentry kind of native to modern web parts that prevent us from having or let us avoid using that? Want to talk through that a bit?
Absolutely. So two of my favorites there are the embed web part and file viewer. So I don't know if anyone remembers the days of you'd go to your classic document library, open up the PowerPoint, get the embed code, paste the embed code into the script editor on another page so you could present a PowerPoint within a page. Maybe it's your next upcoming monthly meeting agenda. That's a lot of steps. And I used to lose a lot of people in that process, and we'd end up just teaching them to edit that same PowerPoint, which wasn't always the best depending on the use case, because then you don't necessarily have a history of all those changes you made, and you'd then have to go to the version history. What's amazing about the new modern file viewer web part is that not only are you just doing it all right from the page with no code, when you're selecting to choose the file, you can actually navigate to the site contents of your site, the different libraries, and even upload from that same window. So I know we just talked about one scenario that was more maybe limiting, but there's a lot of other examples where classic to modern actually gave us a huge improvement in these processes. One of the other ones that we have is with embed. So this is limited to iframe, what can be within, and I'll defer to one of my dev colleagues to dig a little bit deeper into that. But primarily you can do things like host your videos in Microsoft Stream, which is kind of like the YouTube equivalent for work, and then grab that embed code and embed it right into the page so you have your videos there as well.
And there is a little gotcha there with the embed, right? You got to go into the admin console and make sure that provider, if it's an external provider, is basically whitelisted for you, right? So if you're using externally hosted video on like Bright Cove or Brainshark or a service like that, won't work by default. You've got to open up a door to let them be able to do that, correct?
Yes, excellent flag. Thank you, Mike.
Can we talk about there's a lot of places where we used to use content query web parts, and I think we've got new alternatives to that. Or actually, before we do that, let me pause and ask Mark and Peggy and our other guests if there's anything that you want us to focus on from among this map. Like, we can go through point by point and talk through it, but I'd really like to hear what's important to you and have us drill down on that. The voice lines are open, and we're also monitoring the chat as well.
Hildy and Laurie, that includes you as well, of course. Anyone who wants to say something.
Julie, anything else you want to instigate?
I want to instigate something because that's what I do, right?
Shelley's in the house.
Bring it on.
Shelley!
The instigator in chief is here.
Yeah, events. I hate the fact that recurring events can't be on events, and it's a total loser in terms of adoption, because people are like, but we have a weekly meeting. I'm not going to put that in 52 times. Thanks very much.
So I can talk to a solution that Mark and I implemented for that, and it did show the recurring events. We ended up using the P&P search web part to pull the search events from the events lists, and it was actually multiple events lists across multiple sites in a hub. And then unfortunately we needed to recreate the layout for the out of the box navigation, with the box and the dates and stuff like that, and create that as a handlebars template. I think that functionality with the PNP search got changed. So now you have a little more control over the layout, and you've got some of the more modern React like UI in there. But that's how I would fix that problem. To do it that way. If you just need like a text link with some more basic information, you may be able to use highlighted content as well. Now that it supports KQL.
Yeah, I mean, that PNP search web part is like a total Swiss Army knife, and just constantly getting better.
But again, not something that a lower level site owner can cope with.
It doesn't help with recurring events. Part of what you were talking about.
It does.
Expansion doesn't really happen. We were able to do some monkey business with some query language stuff, I think.
Yeah, you do have to know or have enough knowledge of search query language to be able to put that on the page and configure it properly. That is the one drawback to implementing it that I've noticed when trying to deal with clients and use it with clients.
Yeah, and quite frankly, a floor nurse manager who just wants to show their nursing committee that's not what they do.
Agreed.
Agreed.
Yeah.
So,
totally agreed.
Microsoft did announce some improved calendaring web parts recently, I think.
That was my next question, Mark. If any of the MVPs had line of sight.
This may be one of those lines I'm not supposed to cross. But they absolutely understand that this is an issue, and the recommendation, I'll just use the group calendar, doesn't necessarily solve that problem, because sometimes it's not the group calendar that you want to display, it's events from other places. So it's a whole. It absolutely is a whole. Between the events and the group calendar, you can cover some use cases.
One of the options, again, definitely acknowledging that it's a whole and this isn't the perfect solution, but sometimes syncing the calendars to Outlook and then dragging over those individual occurrences is a little bit more palatable than recreating all individual 52. Again, doesn't fully meet that need, but could be a workaround temporarily.
Quite frankly, the workaround that they're using is just put a button on the page that goes to the old classic calendar looking thing and say, I'm over it.
That is certainly a way that some people are solving it, absolutely.
Yeah, Mark and I have been on a bunch of calls where people have said, that same thing, and not specifically about the recurring meeting, but the lack of the calendar interface. And that causes people a lot of consternation. Mark's discussion is normally, do you really need it as a calendar? Can you do the thing you want to do with it not laid out like that? But yeah, that comes up a lot. You're not alone in that frustration.
Is there anything on user voice we should point people to?
I can take a peek and see if I can find it.
Yeah.
I would say that one of the predominant use cases, certainly in the land that I live in, is personal time off. That site after site after site, the managers want people to put their time off on a calendar, and they want to be able to easily work with it. And it's a big, big gap. I mean, aside from the weekly meeting thing, that's a gap in the events web part. The whole idea of where are we as a team keeping our time off, and now, some sites are teamified, some sites are not teamified, some have a group calendar, some have Outlook shared calendars. And so the lack of consistency of the user experience is rough.
Well, that's also a lack of experience of the team involved deciding how to manage that data, right? I mean, if it's that important, then they ought to come up with, maybe the solution is not perfect, but if they have a group calendar, use the group calendar. If they're on a classic site, use the classic calendar. And I think that gets tricky where you've got an organization that is sort of halfway between classic and modern, because the experience is going to be inconsistent.
Yep, and some are teamified and some are not, and so on and so forth. And a lot of these are legacy problems of the site was created in SharePoint 2007 and then migrated to 10 and then online and then it, and so again, I think that this is a big gap in the thinking. And I know how hard calendars are technically, so I'm not slamming anything about that, but this is one of those places where I think that there just isn't an equivalent that works.
Yeah.
So Emily, I see you pasted in the user voice on modernizing the calendars.
Yeah, there's a couple different ones, so I'm going to keep pasting them over with kind of calling out what they are, because there's a couple different flavors of what people are looking for with calendars. It's a hot topic.
Good. We can pick up a quick, 10 votes for our pet issues while we're on this call. That's not bad. Place to start.
Viva!
Right?
It's funny. I think on some level, Microsoft sort of hoped that if they, and this is me making this up, this is not them telling me anything, that if they didn't do anything for a while, people would just give up on the whole, like, let me have the desktop calendar on my screen.
If we ignore it, maybe it'll go away.
Yeah, and it's just, that's not what's happening, and people still want it. So I know that they're working on it now.
Do we want to talk about the list and library viewer web parts? I know, Shelley, to pick on you, I remember our early struggles with the just completely inadequate list viewer web part, library viewer web part, and I know things have changed and advanced since then. Are there any key points for us to make there?
I think that, in general, things have improved greatly. There are some default settings on things like links lists that people have created where you bring them in on the web part and brings in notes and the icon. And it's like really, I end up resetting all of those manually all the time just so I can get a clean links list off of it. And it flies in the face of, but you've got quick links and you've got other better web parts for it, but people don't want to redo them because they had a links list. They've now imported that as part of an upgrade and they want to make use of it. So some styling around that would have been nice, but it is working and that's fine. I think that the document library experience has really come so far. Yeah. And it's very exciting to see some of the things that you can do with it now, and all of the filtering and the JSON that can be added in terms of making it a little bit more lively visually, I think is also a really great help. Still struggle with problems of widths, because even though you can make them sticky, there's just not enough real estate on a page to really show the depth of the library if you've got a lot of custom columns in it. But
sure.
In
That's
general,
just a real estate question, yeah.
Yeah, in general, aside from the real estate question, I think that as I say, the functionality is light years ahead of where it had been.
And Shelley, I'm sure there are some very good and probably very familiar looking links list web parts out there in the PNP community. They might look familiar to you.
Yeah, and again, I think that the community is doing a really great job of offering up options and getting
gaps.
Yeah, and filling gaps, exactly. And I think that's just such a great resource.
Awesome. That's how we roll. 5 minutes till the top of the hour. So are there any other key capabilities that we want to highlight here? I mean, the highlighted content web part is the one that I kind of misstated last week, like my new favorite web part. I said featured content because I was thinking about those old hub web parts on PNP, but anybody want to talk about the highlighted content web part and how powerful it is or where it might be used?
I'm happy to. I mean, the content by search web part was one that came out with, I think, SharePoint 2013. Does that sound right? And it was a very powerful web part to be out of the box. It was the successor to content query that required you to write XSL, and it was rough. Content by search was a really good step in the right direction. So I'm talking about those because the highlighted content web part really becomes the successor to that, and then the modern PNP, the PNP modern search solution web parts go even further. But highlighted content web part it understands all of the sort of out of the box types of content that you might have in your sites. And so it's very good for selectively exposing or rolling up content from across your tenant. And if you look at all of the different settings that it's got, you can actually accomplish a heck of a lot with it. You know, it's generally used to embed. It's a search-driven experience in a page. So you're going and you're grabbing content from wherever based on some criteria. You have to have a good information architecture to really make this work. So, you know, you have to be using content types well, or at least using the out-of-the-box capabilities well. Like, I want to show news from these 4 sites. You could use the news web part, or you could use the highlighted content web part there, especially if you wanted to mix in some other types of content. And that addition of the KQL query capability also allows you to issue search-like, you know, the KQL is one of the languages that we can use to talk to the search engine. So you can get even more sophisticated in how you're identifying the content you want to display. So if you haven't looked at that one in maybe, you know, I don't know, probably the last year or so, it's got a lot more capability than it used to. It may meet a lot of your needs.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, that might be something to drill down into in the future as well. We didn't really talk about the text web part, which is like an unspoken hero in some places. I probably shouldn't use the word hero because the hero web part is out there for images, but I don't know if folks are aware of the ability to use Wiki markup to make links in text web parts now. I think that's pretty new, Emily, like the last month or two.
Well, that text web part supports full HTML. I have written a custom solution that basically scrapes HTML off a public-facing website and pastes it into a SharePoint page. And the way I'm doing that is just pulling the HTML off the page, and I write the HTML directly into the text editor web part, and it renders perfectly. So those things are fully HTML compatible. So that, you know, maybe that's useful. You can do HTML, you can paste that into just the text web part.
In addition to just the rich authoring experience that you have now.
Right.
One of the things that a lot of people don't realize is that you know, there's a toolbar on that text web part, and then over on the right there's a ... That ... opens up an entire panel with additional formatting options. In my experience, not a lot of people know about that. I clicked on it one day by accident after I was frustrated about something. It's like, there's got to be something better here. So it's not necessarily obvious that all those extra capabilities are there. One of which is inserting a table, which is something that people want to do a lot.
Right, which is basically just doing an HTML table, so that's why it's sort of, I think those things, it's just trying to abstract that HTML authoring layer. So that's, yeah, it's absolutely more powerful, I think, than people think it is.
Those tables are wonderful until you try to look at them on a phone. Right?
Right.
Really terrible in terms of responsive.
Well,
and if you're thinking about a multi-device approach, those tables in HTML are not your best friend necessarily, right?
Not a responsive way to go.
Exactly.
So, you know, you always have to build your content understanding who the consumers are going to be.
Yep, fair point. Comes back to Emily's point, right? It's all about the content. Understand your content, then pick the right tools from the palette. I'm going to advance. Emily, we had all of these visuals in here. We didn't touch on any of them. Which is fine. Like, we can leave them in here. We can ship components like this out. I was just trying to get to the closing slide, but we dropped in so much content here. If you search text.
Okay, we'll have that.
There we go.
If you're going through it, it's going to be in the recording, so people can go back to the recording and
freeze frame my like 2-second glimpse of the.
Yeah, you went a little fast. That's okay. I'm not judging.
Still learning how to use PowerPoint. Thank you.
I always watch recordings at 1/16 speed, so
you'll be perfect, man. So a couple of takeaways. Obviously, we highlighted that PNP search web part, of which we are big fans. Derek, I know you've made a living off of that in the past. in a little bit more detail about classic and modern web part experience. I believe that points right to the Microsoft docs, correct?
Yes. To the
classic and modern web part experiences, right?
I really don't know because that's Mark's link. Let me see. I think I have this open in my other tab.
Just in the interest of time, we're running we're a minute over right now. We would like to talk about task management. As we were preparing for this meeting, and we were talking about using OneNote to do Outlook tasks, task lists in SharePoint, Microsoft Project, Azure DevOps, etc. We realized that.
Don't forget to do.
Don't forget Microsoft To Do. Sorry, I thought I had that.
And Planner.
And Planner, right? Sure. Like there's an awful lot out there. It's a really crowded and confusing.
And my piece of paper that's.
Yeah.
I just keep it all right up here. That's all I need.
There are as many ways to manage tests as there are people managing them, apparently. But we want to drill down a little bit on that and think about what are some of the optimal use cases. How do some of these tools work together in ways that people may not have thought of? So that's 2 weeks out, and that's going to be Emily. That's a session that you just got accepted, right, to speaking sessions at an event too, right?
Yes. So it'll be have an expanded one on that later towards the end of the year at the Nashville user group in SB Fest Dallas.
Cool. So if no one, if we can hang on, if people have questions, we can run a little bit over. If isn't anything we've tackled in the chat or in the conversation, and as always, if you've got ideas for future sessions, things that really matter to you, that's what this is about. So please use the link at the bottom to submit them. Give us your questions and your ideas. Plus, you generally know how to find us. Don't hesitate. We're all pretty active online. Anything else?
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah.
All right,
Thank
people.
you very much.
Thanks for spending some of your lunch hour with us. Look forward to talking soon.
Bye, buddy.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.